right, so good morning, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, and I know we have a whole whack of you that are joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. So I'm particularly excited for today's session. Today's session is with our basically rising star at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants in terms of a speaker. We brought him on for the first time a few months back, and every time we come on, he just gets a bigger and bigger audience, and rightfully so, because he is one of Canada's rising conservation leaders and stars. He's an amazing scientist, science communicator, and more. We are going to have a really good time together. I want to stress before we dive in with him that for this program on pollinators, we had more registered classes than we did for our last astronaut. So it speaks to the power of Peter as a speaker and of pollinators as a topic. Kids around the world are super keen on bees, butterflies, and more. It's a really, really exciting chance to showcase a really important conservation topic that is not only big on a global scale, but is one that you guys at home can really take part in to make a positive difference. So I am so excited to dive in today. We're also going to talk a little bit about Backyard Bio coming up really soon, which is my baby here at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. Let's have a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining us, whether you're live or on YouTube. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Peter Soroye, researcher at the University of Ottawa, science communicator, all-around fantastic human being, and awesome pollinator all-star. So, Peter, thank you so much for joining us today, man, and take us away.
Thank you so much, Jesse. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so excited that other people are just as excited as pollinators and understanding climate change and saving the world as I am. So it's awesome to chat with everyone today. Yeah, so Jesse gave a super great intro. Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the research that I do as a conservation biologist and a PhD student, a little bit about pollinators. I'm gonna talk a little bit about climate change and what it's doing to the world. And then I'm gonna talk about Backyard Bio and how you can help save the world, even starting today in your own backyard. I'm gonna start off with a little bit of an introduction. So this is me. I'm Peter. I'm a PhD student at the University of Ottawa. This is where Ottawa is on the map. It's Canada's capital city. It's a beautiful place. It's about 3 hours from Toronto, where Drake lives, about 2 hours from Montreal, and it's a great place. And so I'm doing my PhD there. I've been doing it for the last couple of years, and I'm a conservation biologist. And that means that I focus on researching what's going on in the world. I study things like climate change and like habitat loss. I study basically the things that humans are doing to the world around us and how that's having an impact on ecosystems and wildlife. And especially I focus on pollinators, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I want to stress the fact as well that even though I'm a scientist, even though I do research all the time, I used to think scientists were always super serious, we're always in lab coats, but really we're all just regular people. So I love Star Wars, I love basketball, and shout out the Toronto Raptors. I love music, and scientists are all like that. They all have interests, we're all just regular people. And so, the only common factor of scientists and researchers is that we're passionate about exploring the world, about discovering new things about it, and about testing questions, asking questions and testing them to find answers and figuring out more about the world around us. And so if you're like that, if you're interested and passionate, if you like to explore, you like to discover new things about the world, then you're pretty close to being a scientist yourself. In fact, you might already be one. So I mentioned that in my work, I study a lot of pollinators, and especially I focus on bumblebees. And bumblebees, I'll just say it up front, are the most adorable, the cutest insects of all time. You've probably seen them outside. They're pretty large, and if you haven't seen them, then you've probably heard them, because bumblebees are really big. They're really fuzzy. They're like the teddy bears of the sky, and they're very loud because they're so big. In terms of insects, they buzz very loudly, and this actually helps them be great pollinators. And I'll mention a little bit more about that later. But bumblebees are really great. They're wild pollinators, and they're really important for our ecosystems and for us as humans. So in our wild landscapes, about 75% to 95% of all flowering plants need help with pollination. And pollination, you might know already, but as a reminder, pollination is just the transfer of pollen from one flower to another flower. So every flowering plant, whether it's a daisy or even trees, need to have this pollen transferred from one flower to another flower. And some plants can do this on their own. They just produce a whole lot of pollen and they release it into the wind or they throw it up in the air. And because they make so much pollen, these plants, which we call wind pollinated, the pollen just like by chance falls on another plant. And so some plants can do that completely by themselves. They can achieve this pollination. Other plants need help with it. And so I have here on the slide some common pollinators that you might be familiar with. Of course, we have bumblebees, which are amazing pollinators, and you can see them if you watch them on flowers. You'll watch them stomp around the flowers, and they're looking for nectar. But as they look for this nectar on the flowers, they're picking up pollen on their body. And so on this picture of the bee, you can see, if you look closely, little yellow and white dots. And those little yellow and white dots are little bunches of pollen that this bee has picked up on its body. And when it flies to the next flower, it'll transfer that pollen from this flower to the next one, and it'll achieve that pollination, that transfer of pollen from one flower to another. Some other pollinators that are really great in our wild landscapes are things like butterflies and moths, things like flies, and in tropical parts of the world, bats are actually really great pollinators as well. And some flowers in the tropics have evolved their strategies to only open up at night. And so the flower is closed in the day, but at night it opens up so that bats can fly in and pollinate that flower. So there's a huge range of pollinators, and they really hold together a lot of the wild landscapes around us. Whenever we think about forests or meadows or safaris or any sort of like wild landscape, it's usually held together by the flowering plants in it. And that usually means that it's held together with pollinators. And so without pollinators, a lot of these wild places would start to fall apart. And a lot of the animals that depend on these flowering plants would start to fall apart as well. Of course, for us as humans, in a more practical sense, pollinators are really important as well because they pollinate a lot of our food. On average, about 1 out of every 3 bites of food that you eat is there because of animal pollinators, like bees and like other pollinators. And this 1 out of 3 bites of food is usually the most delicious and nutritious parts of our diet as well. So things like fruits and vegetables, things like berries and nuts, even chocolate and coffee are animal pollinated or depend on animal pollinators in some way. And even things like cotton as well, things like that we make our clothes with. A lot of these materials that come from plants depend on some sense in pollinators as well. So without pollinators, we'd have a much less colorful and less flavorful life as humans as well. So they're really important. And in North America and Europe, bumblebees are some of the best pollinators of all the pollinators that we have. And this is for a few different reasons. For one, bumblebees are wild pollinators. There's actually a whole lot of different species of bumblebees around the world, about 260, even a little above that, across the world. And all of these different species of bumblebee have adapted in some way or another, have evolved to help pollinate flowers. And so the native flowers in North America, around where you live, or in Europe or elsewhere, wherever you are in the world, require wild pollinators to pollinate them. And because bumblebees are wild pollinators across a lot of the world, they're really important for those wild landscapes. Because bumblebees are so big and so fuzzy, because they have these jackets, these parkas on, they're really great at pollinating in colder temperatures as well. So in the spring and in the fall, bumblebees are sometimes the very first pollinators out in the year, and sometimes the last pollinators to leave in the fall, because they can fly in low temperatures. When other insects like butterflies and flies are too cold to fly, bumblebees, because they're so large, because they have their fur, they can create a lot of energy by using their muscles, a lot of heat by using their muscles, and they can trap that heat close to their body. And so they can fly in pretty cold temperatures, which is super useful in places like Canada and in cold places in the United States and elsewhere. The other thing that bumblebees can do that not a lot of other pollinators can is what we call buzz pollination. And this is what I hinted at earlier about how you can hear bumblebees sometimes before you can see them. And that's because bumblebees are so large, they vibrate so hard that they can actually, when they land on a flower, they just kind of shake the flower and they actually physically dislodge. They actually knock off the pollen from the flower. And some plants, things like tomatoes especially, they need this buzz pollination. If smaller pollinators land on a tomato flower that can't buzz pollinate, then these pollinators will not pollinate the tomato plant. They won't be able to knock the pollen off, and they won't be able to transfer it to another tomato flower. So we need big pollinators, things like bumblebees, to achieve this buzz pollination. And so they're really, really important for us in a lot of different ways. But unfortunately, across the world, across North America and Europe, bumblebees are disappearing. And this is why I'm studying them, because when we look at them over time, over the last couple of decades, we see that bumblebees are disappearing across a lot of the world. And so there's a lot less bumblebees to be found, and there's a lot less species of bumblebees to be found. Even as a really dramatic example, when your parents were growing up, if they were to go into a field if your parents or grandparents were in a field when they were younger, they were probably seeing a lot more species of bumblebee and a lot more bumblebees than you would if you were to go in the same field right now today. So even over a few decades, we've been seeing a really dramatic decline in the number of bumblebees across the world. And this is obviously really worrying for a lot of reasons, but especially because these bumblebees are pollinators, but also because they're just so beautiful. I think it's a really big shame that if I go out into a field now, I won't be able to see the same type of beauty that people were able to a couple of decades ago. So I think it's important to save them. When we look at the reasons why bumblebees are disappearing, and this is where a lot of my research focuses on, one of the things that I'm finding and that others are finding is that bumblebees are under threat from a lot of different things, but especially climate change. You might be familiar with climate change. You might know that it's a human-induced phenomenon. As humans emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, this heats up the earth. It creates this greenhouse effect. And so year after year, temperatures are getting warmer and warmer. But that's only one aspect of climate change. Another thing that climate change does is create this climate chaos. And climate chaos is the unpredictability of weather. And it means that extreme weather events, things like heat waves and droughts, are becoming more common and are becoming worse and worse every year. So heat waves in the summer, for example, are reaching higher temperatures every year and are stretching out for longer and longer periods of the summer. And this is really worrying for bumblebees. Bumblebees have these parkas on, right, that help them pollinate in colder temperatures. But it means that they're not as well able to deal with heat in the summer. And so extreme heat events are a really worrying phenomenon for them. Extreme events and the unpredictability of weather is also dangerous in other ways as well. It's not just the summer temperatures that are worrying for bumblebees. It's also things like heat waves in the spring. We don't think about this too often, but it might have happened to you this summer actually, or this spring actually. It happened where I am. We had in February or in very early March just this huge heat wave, and so all the snow melted. It was like super warm all of a sudden, and this lasted for like a week, and then all of a sudden we were back to regular snow and cold temperatures. These sorts of heat waves in the spring are really damaging for bumblebees because it wakes bumblebees up. You have all of these queens that are all of a sudden waking up in the middle of the springtime, thinking that it's the start of the season, and they're out looking for food, for nesting habitats. And then a few days later, the temperatures drop again, and these bees can't handle the cold like that, and so they end up dying. So this unpredictability of weather, the climate chaos that climate change makes, is a really worrying phenomenon for these bees, and is causing them to disappear. Other things that are causing bumblebees to disappear are things like habitat loss or destruction of habitat, which destroys flowering and food resources and also nesting resources, and things like pesticides as well. Pesticides are really important for our crops. They kill the pests and they kill the bad bugs, but pesticides kill good bugs as well. And so if we don't use them carefully, we can end up killing a lot of our pollinators that we depend on for those very same crops. All of these things are working together to cause bumblebees to disappear. And in most cases, it's not a single one of these things that is causing bumblebees or other animals to decline. In most cases, in most parts of the world, it's all of these things together. Bumblebees are experiencing all of these threats at the same time. And this makes it really difficult for them to survive and persist in the face of all of these things. And it's not just bumblebees that are disappearing across the planet. It's a whole lot of different animals, from plants to birds to other mammals and reptiles and amphibians and other insects all across the world and our planet. We're seeing declines in wildlife and in biodiversity. And we're seeing the ecosystems across the globe begin to decline and suffer as well. But that's not the end of the story. There's a lot of things that we can do to help save our planet and to help save the bees. A lot of things that you can even do starting today. And, it's not, there are a lot of things that we can do. In a lot of cases, we already know exactly what we need to do as well. We know what we need to do to stop climate change. We know what we need to do to prevent extinctions. And in the cases where we don't know what we need to do, then we know how to find those answers. And in a lot of cases, the answers of what we need to do can be figured out by just having more information on where animals are. If we know where different species of bumblebees are now, and we know where they were in the past, and we can have an idea of where they might go in the future, then we can start to tell, what species are at risk of extinction, what species need conservation and need to be recovered after they've declined. Or we can, if we have this sort of information, we can figure out what species are doing well, in what places species are surviving, fine and thriving, and we can learn lessons from these bright spots as well. So having more information helps us save the world. It helps us create solutions for conservation and figure out what we can do to help save the planet. And there are a lot of programs in the last couple of years, community science programs that recruit regular people like you, like me, like everybody watching this, to collect this sort of information. Community science programs like iNaturalist, like eBird, eButterfly, Bumblebee Watch, all of these recruit people to go outside on their own time to explore the world around them, and to submit photos or to submit records of animals or plants that they're seeing. And all of this information that people collect gets added to these databases. And these databases get sent to scientists, to researchers like me, like others around the world. And then we can use this information to help save the world, to help develop these solutions for helping animals survive in the face of climate change and habitat loss and other things. The information that you contribute to these websites really does help save the world. I've done some research on this type of information and looked at how useful it is, whether it actually tells us new things about the planet. And I found that it does. It tells us huge amounts of information, more so, or different types of information than even expert collectors can tell us. So the data that's submitted to sites like iNaturalist, eButterfly, and eBird can tell us new things about where species live, can tell us new things about when species emerge or when they migrate. And sometimes community scientists can find new species that were never known to science, or they can find species in new places that scientists never knew. So contributing to these type of things really does help save the planet, really does help us build better conservation solutions. BackyardBio in a couple of weeks is going to be a super great way to start getting involved with this, if you're not already. And it'll be a great opportunity to join the community of people excited about conservation, people excited about the natural world. And it's just a super awesome time. I'd super recommend signing up, joining BackyardBio, even just as yourself, and just take some time, take a couple of days, a couple of hours during the month to go outside in your own backyard, or on a hike, or to a park, to look at some of the world around you and to take some photos, to submit some observations, and discover a little more. Last year, I had an absolute blast doing this. I was able to find things like baby raccoons snoozing in a tree, things like turtles basking in the sun, or yellow warblers singing their little hearts out. And I was able to find, I was able to look a little closer at looking for bees, obviously, and I was able to find a whole lot of really cool small wildlife, and really exciting small biodiversity and things of the little world. So things like these metallic green bees, things like electric blue and green damselflies, and beautiful butterflies, and birds taking baths. And all of these photos that I've just showed as well, I took right in the middle of the city. This is Ottawa, this is where I live, and this is where I took all of those photos that I just showed. So, go outside, even in your own backyard, even right in the middle of the city, you can find some really, really amazing pieces of nature. And you could very well be surprised by what you might find, even in the middle of the city. And if you're able to travel further abroad, to look for things, that's super cool. Probably unlikely in the given all the difficulties with traveling. But the other really cool part about Backyard Bio and about community science is that you can look at what other people are seeing as well. So in Backyard Bio, you can look at the pictures that other people are submitting, and that means that you can explore with them. You can see some of the wild animals and amazing sights that other people might be seeing across the world as well. And on iNaturalist, you can help identify them. You can find out more about them. So it's really just an awesome way to explore the world around you and get to know a little bit more about the planet that you live on. And at the same time, of course, save it as well. So on that note, I'll end, and I'd like to thank again Jesse. Thank everybody for tuning in and watching. It's been a pleasure to chat with you guys, and I'm so excited to answer some questions about pollinators or climate change or conservation more broadly, or about being a scientist and being a PhD student or anything. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was awesome as always. If you want to come out of screen share so we can see you again, you can see us have a bit of a conversation. Let's dive in. We've got over 11 other classrooms on YouTube. Another one joined us live. So we've got like 350 kids from New York, Louisiana, Manitoba, and all across Ontario today. So welcome into all of you guys. Peter was mentioning Backyard Bio at the end there. I want to stress, I'll bring this up on the screen. If you guys want to check out our website at BackyardBio.net, we've already got 160 classes registered from 8 countries around the world. So you can register to be put in touch with other classrooms around the globe. So if you're in Ontario, you can be put in touch potentially with classes in BC and in Florida and in Edinburgh and Scotland to connect and share and sort of revel in biodiversity near you. I'm going to bring up all the links that Peter shared as well on the screen at the end, but there's so many ways to take part. Love to have you guys get involved, and you can always email us at ebtsoip@gmail.com to find out even more. Let's dive in with questions, guys. That was awesome as always. I'm going to start with Miss Hamilton, who I didn't realize was the Miss Hamilton that I've been chatting with so much lately in emails, and is the most enthusiastic emailer of all time. So Miss Hamilton joining us in Brampton. Hi. Nice to meet you finally. This is great. You got to be with Joe last time, so I missed out.
That's right. That's right. So at least 3 of my students are asking, are other insects like wasps and hornets also pollinators?
Yeah, they are. That's a really great question, especially with wasps, because wasps and hornets are actually great pollinators. And wasps, I know, are super annoying, especially at the end of the summer when the wasps are invading every single picnic that you have, or trying to drink every single glass of lemonade or juice that you bring outside. That is super annoying. But they actually do that for a really interesting reason. So yeah, wasps are great pollinators. Hornets are really great pollinators, and they rely on bringing back a lot of the sugar from nectar and other things into their nest. And then the larvae in hornet nests and wasp nests, they kind of reproduce or reprocess that nectar that they bring back, and they create this energy drink, this kind of sugar drink that the adult wasps will eat and use to as energy to do whatever. And at the end of the summer, when there aren't as many larvae in the nest anymore, wasps, they miss a lot of that like ultra processed kind of like sugar. And so they end up trying to seek it out in other ways. And that's why they're so annoying, especially at the end of the year and not so much at the start of the summer, is because they are missing a lot of that that kind of energy boost from the nest. And so they have to seek it out in other places like your picnic food and like your soda.
Great first question, Ms. Hamilton. Awesome. Let's head to Ms. Dole's class, our one live full class today. I know it's really weird for Ontario teachers right now, but Ms. Dole's class, you guys are all chilling in the class. Unmute that mic, come on up, and if you have a question for us, go for it. While you guys are unmuting that mic, I'll welcome in our class joining in Montreal as well. This is like a cross North America adventure today. I'm pretty excited. Come on up, and if you have a question for us, go for it. While you guys are unmuting that mic, I'll welcome in our class joining in Montreal as well.
Tell them, what's your question?
Like a cross North America adventure today.
Why? How many stripes do bees have?
Oh, that's a great question. It'll depend on the species of bee. But for bumblebees, you probably know they have 3 big body sections. They have the head, the thorax, the abdomen. And on each part of their body, they have different stripes. And all bumblebees have, or most species of bumblebees have, different striping patterns that they have. And that's one way we can use to identify different bumblebees, is by looking at the different stripe pattern on their body and matching up. They can range in color. Can be yellow, some can be black, some can be orange or red. And so we can usually kind of identify them based on that pattern. And they tend to have, it varies from species to species, but I think in general they have usually about 13 stripes in total sometimes. But again, it depends on species to species.
Cool question, man. Thanks for that. Let's head to Miss Russell, also joining us in Brampton, right down the street from me here in Toronto. Miss Russell, if you want to come on in, go for it.
Yeah, hi. So we have a few questions. The first is about how do plants actually attract pollinators, and including plants like that are carnivorous. So do they actually attract pollinators, and are they helpful for pollinators?
Oh, that's an awesome question. So I guess I'll answer the first one first. Usually plants take a variety of strategies sometimes to attract pollinators. Usually the strategy is to produce nectar. Nectar is like, a really high sugar type of substance. Sorry. So it's kind of like, it's like Red Bull almost. And for insects that use up so much energy as they fly, or for hummingbirds or other pollinators, that nectar is a really important boost of energy, or resource of energy that they can use throughout the day. And so most plants produce this nectar, and it attracts the pollinators just by being there. And the flowers are usually designed in such a way that as the pollinators land on the flower and go to drink the nectar, then they'll end up touching the pollen part of the flower, either the anther or the stamen, and it'll end up either picking up pollen onto the pollinator body or transferring pollen onto the flower. So usually flowers are it's kind of like a structural design. They have pollen, at the bottom of the flower, and so somewhere along the edge, they have the pollen that's going to get transferred on or transferred off of the pollinator. Other flowers, though, have other strategies. Some of them look like pollinators. So some flowers will like mimic a bee, and so the bees land on the flower thinking that it's another bee, and they'll try to mate with this flower, this fake bee. And as they attempt to mate with the flower, they'll end up transferring pollen. So flowers can be super devious. They have a huge variety of different strategies and structures to help attract pollinators. As for carnivorous plants, that's a really awesome question. And I'll be honest, I don't know. I don't know if they have. I know they often attract insects in different sort of ways. Sometimes also with different substances that will, kind of lead them in, like a Hansel and Gretel type of affair where they end up getting trapped at the end of it. But I don't know if they attract pollinators in the same way, or what they do for that. That's an awesome question.
I love when scientists admit that they don't know something offhand. So thank you so much for that, and for the phrase Hansel and Gretel type affair, which there's no usage of that in any one of our programs ever. By the way, if you need a drink or anything like that, by all means, go get one for a second. If you need a second, awesome. Here, while Peter's taking a little bit of a drink, I want to give him a chance to clear his throat. One other neat thing about pollinators and flowers, how they get attracted to these flowers. I really encourage all our classes, when you're done this program today, go outside and look at flowers. And you'll often see in the middle of flowers, there's something that's a different color in the middle. So we see that as a slightly different color. Insects see that as almost like a glowing beacon, sort of a bullseye to land on, because their eyes see in a little bit of a different frequency than ours see. They see into the ultraviolet, which we can't see as people, but to them is something that's really, really special, really, really bright. And I think that's just such a neat thing of sort of understanding the animal kingdom, is that there are different ways of going about existing on this planet. And there's sort of neat sensory adaptations that a lot of creatures have. So very cool question, guys. All right, I'm going to take a question from Miss C's class that's able to join us. I'm pretty sure from New York in just a minute, and then we'll take a few questions from YouTube before going into a second round. So Miss C's class, if you guys want to come on in and unmute your mic, yeah, in Central New York, come on in.
Hi, Jesse. Yeah, we joined at the last minute. I checked my email and wham, there was a spot available. Thank you.
My pleasure.
We have a question. Let's see. Let me go back up here. Bear with me. Oh, Taylor from my class wants to know, why do they sting you when you were just walking by?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. One of the true mysteries of nature. Usually, so bees, they sting because they feel like they need to defend themselves, is the short answer. And so usually they only sting you if you're swatting at them, or if you're really close to their nest, then they'll sting you. Usually they try not to sting. And for honeybees, it's pretty well known. Most people know that when a honeybee stings you, it actually removes the whole stinger from its body. So the stingers are barbed, and so when honeybees sting, they try to pull out the stinger, and it just rips apart their whole body. And so the bee dies for honeybees. For bumblebees and for wasps and hornets and other Other types of bees, they can sting multiple times because their stingers aren't barbed, so they can just pull it out and sting again if they have to. But they usually try not to. Bumblebees especially are super gentle. They usually tend not to sting you. But you never know. Sometimes it's hard to tell. Sometimes you don't realize how close you are to a nest. Bee nests can be super inconspicuous. Bumblebees nest often in the ground, and so they'll take over old mouse dens or kind of burrows into the ground. Wasps can live, and all sorts of bees can live inside walls or in bundles of sticks or under logs. And so sometimes it's just really difficult to see a nest. And if a bee is stinging you and it's not because you were swatting at it, it might be because the nest is actually really close by you and you haven't noticed. But that's a great question.
It is a great question. I'm really glad we got a stinging question. A lot of YouTube, of course, is highlighting this. I mean, so Peter, I'm curious. So in my lifetime, I've been stung by a bee twice. Once was when I picked it up and played with it as a little kid, which is not the best idea. And the other, I went swimming and I switched out of my swim shorts and it was in my pants that I left on the beach. Bee does not want to be in your pants. Not a good time. So 2 times in my whole life. How many times have you been stung doing the work that you do?
Yeah, I've never been stung doing the work that I do. And that really speaks to how gentle bumblebees are. As a funny story, when I was first going out to catch bumblebees in the field, I was so prepared. I had my butterfly net, which is, for butterflies, we swing and we catch it and we gently take them out of the net. And I was expecting it would be the same thing for bumblebees, but the person I was with was like, no, hold up. That's not, we don't swing nets around or anything. And they had a really small, a jar like you would use for beads or something like that. And they just walked up to the bumblebee on the flower and just gently closed the jar over the bee. And they just picked it up just like that. They were able to get right up close to it and put it on, and it was no problem. And then when we were done with the bee, they just unscrewed it and let it fly away. So yeah, most bees are super gentle. I've never been stung in the field. I have been stung twice by wasps, but that was another story. And I was right in the middle of the nest, so it was well deserved.
Your love for nature is so palpable. It's kind of fun for me watching the teachers in the background, just because it's such a nice story. So thank you for that, Peter. By the way, I think from that story, we have a good answer to this, but Isabella in Miss Stangolis' class wants to know, what made you want to become a biologist? If you could share that with us.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And, I got to grow up outside. I grew up in Northern Ontario in North Bay. And so I got to spend a lot of time outdoors. We had this little forest near me, and so we would always be in it and flipping over logs, trying to find little salamanders or rocks. And there's a tiny stream that ran through it. And so I kind of grew up outside, going to parks like Algonquin Park as well in Ontario. I grew up flipping through National Geographic magazines and watching documentaries. And, the world was just such an amazing place for me. It still is. And I wanted to be a biologist to explore it and to see some of these incredible things in beautiful places. And as I started, more and more of my school and studies, I realized all of the things that humans are doing to the world and how a lot of these beautiful places and beautiful creatures might not be on the planet anymore in 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years. And so it became really important to me to try to save these species so that I can see them, so that my kids can see them in future generations and whatnot. So that's why I'm a biologist. The short answer.
That's a beautiful answer, Peter. Let's take a couple more from YouTube, and then we'll go back through our live classes. We're whipping through these. Peter, as you can see, is a master answer of these questions, which is awesome. So Miss Hood's class, they're joining us in Hatboro, Pennsylvania. They want to know, do you study or figure out how to handle invasive species like spotted lanternflies, very cool, or murder hornets? It was inevitable they'd come up, so do share.
Yeah, shout out the murder hornets. I've never seen a murder hornet. I think it would be kind of cool to see one, as long as I was not murdered. I don't study too many invasive species, although it's funny because there's one invasive species that I get asked about a whole lot, and that people often confuse for bumblebees. And that invasive species is the honeybee. Not a lot of people know this, or not a lot of people always know this, but honeybees are not native to North America. They were brought to this country, to this continent by Europeans. And so they've never, they're basically an invasive species. They're more like chickens than they are like bumblebees in a lot of ways, because we raise these honeybees in these managed hives. They don't survive too well outside of those hives in general. And so they're really important agricultural pollinators. I love honey, so honeybees are the bomb for that. But they are basically an invasive species. And in a lot of cases, when they escape into the wild, or when we have too many managed honeybee hives near the wild, these honeybees can remove resources and nectar from wild pollinators, and it can be one of the things that helps contribute to extinction for wild pollinators like bumblebees. So I don't study too many invasive species outside of that, but honeybees are one invasive species that factors into a lot of my research and stuff like that.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I mean, I know that I've seen you post pictures before of a lot of conservation things where they'll highlight, oh, the species we need to save, and it's a picture of a honeybee, and that's not the species we need to save, because as you said, they're like chickens. They're like a domestic thing that we bring into the habitat. So it's important to make sure that pollinators have habitat and are protected, but just be cognizant of the things that we're really looking to try and save here. It's a very cool point. Guys, I'm going to go back to our live classes, because the YouTube question is a great one to wrap up with. So Ms. Hamilton, if you want to come back in, go for it.
So this is kind of a multifaceted question. So there are a bunch of questions in my class about what is happening and what will happen in the future if the pollinators continue to be diminished. So are there ways that humans can help with pollination? Are there things that we should be doing, like having a garden, for example? And maybe are there other species that are benefiting from pollinators, like bumblebees not being so all over the place, like, for example, butterflies? Are they having a better life now because there are more places for them to get nectar? How does that all work?
Oh yeah, that's such a great question. Thank you for asking. Okay, yeah. So what will happen? What's happening now, and what will happen in the future to pollinators? Right now, pollinators, whether we look at bumblebees or flies or butterflies, or even more broadly outside of that, a lot of pollinators are declining, and I think most scientists are agreeing that in general, biodiversity is kind of in a crisis as species are disappearing and going extinct across the globe. And if we continue at the current pace of the way that we're using the world in kind of an unsustainable fashion, then we might see pollinators disappear entirely in the next couple of decades. And that would be obviously really bad. Our landscapes, our wild landscapes would fall apart. Our agricultural systems would fall apart. Humans are really, resourceful and inventive, and I'm sure we'd figure out ways to survive nonetheless. I think everyone's probably seen that Black Mirror episode where they have, these tiny drones that pollinate, these tiny robot drones that pollinate flowers. Humans are inventive. I'm sure we would find a way to survive in a world without pollinators. But I don't think it's a world that we would really want to live in. It would just be really empty, really kind of colorless and empty. But fortunately, there's a lot of things we can do to stop things from getting to that point. Things like climate change, we know what we need to do. It's more a matter of action than it is of research. When it comes to habitat loss and other things, we know a lot of the time what we need to do. It's just a matter of putting things into action. And so voting, using your vote, electing decision makers that care about the environment as well, that want to save it before it gets to a point of no return is super important. At an individual level, one of the really important things you can do if you want to save wild pollinators is plant a pollinator garden, like you hinted at. This is a super great way to not only provide great pollinator habitat, not only provide kind of flowers and resources for them, but also provide things like nesting habitat. If you have a garden, a pollinator garden that has, logs on the ground, or little bundles of sticks, or old leaves, autumn leaves from the fall that you've just raked into a corner, all of these little elements of structure in a garden can help give nesting habitat. It can also help bees and other pollinators to shelter from extreme events. So if you have, a bundle of leaves that's kind of raked into a corner, this is something that bees can use to shelter from the heat when we have extreme heat waves in the summer. So a pollinator garden, even in the middle of the city, can be an oasis for a lot of pollinators, and it's one really useful thing that you can do to help save them.
From the very first time I had a chance to chat with Peter and we did a program like this, I now have a pile of leaves inside of my garden, and I've been a little less diligent about clearing those dandelions. There's a little bit more food, a little bit more habitat for bees. It's such a small thing, and everyone can do it at their home. If you don't have a backyard, it's something that you can encourage people to do as a community. You can do it in a community garden, perhaps, or you can just spread the word. One of the biggest things about conservation is just making sure people know about these issues and are keen to take part. So thank you so much, Ms. Hamilton, for the great question. Another thing for our group's to, I know we've got groups all over the world, pollinator.org. This is Pollinator Partnership, one of the elite organizations for highlighting how you can create those sort of gardens and really take positive action for bees, butterflies, and more. So do check that out. Miss Doll's class, come on in for a question and go for it.
Are there any plants or pollinators that bees don't like? And can you keep a pollinator as a pet?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me answer the second one first, and then I'll answer the other one. Can you keep a pollinator as a pet? I've definitely actually seen this. You know, a lot of the times it's less common with bees, but with butterflies and other pollinators, well, mostly with butterflies or moths, it's pretty common to find, if people find you know, cocoons or chrysalises or even eggs at the end of the summer or in the fall. Sometimes they'll bring them inside of their house and they'll raise these caterpillars or watch the chrysalis mature into a real butterfly. And I think this is super cool. My little cousins did this actually last summer. They raised, I think it was a monarch butterfly, or it ended up being either a monarch butterfly or a swallowtail, but they were able to watch this caterpillar grow into a chrysalis and spin this beautiful, like, you know, gem-shaped structure, and then emerge as a full butterfly, and they were able to release it into the wild again. So you can, you know, keep a pollinator like that as a pet for a little bit, as long as you release it back into the wild eventually and let it continue its natural life. And it can be a super great learning opportunity too. And the first question was how. Could you repeat the first question?
He wants to know if there's like certain plants that the pollinators do not like.
Yeah, that's another great question. So one thing that pollinators don't like, or that's at least not good for them, is non-native plants. So again, kind of invasive species. Often often when we think of planting flowers, we think of planting ornamental flowers and these really beautiful exotic plants. But those aren't the best for pollinators because they're not native. They can harm the ecosystem as well. And so, you know, native wildflowers are the best things to plant for bees and other pollinators. But in a more specific sense, a lot of flowers are actually designed for certain pollinators. You see this a lot of the time with when you try to compare plants that butterflies and hummingbirds visit versus plants that bees visit. One thing you'll notice is that some plants have really, really long kind of stems, right, where the flower is here, but then the stem kind of continues all the way to this like thing at the bottom. It's like a trumpet shape almost. Some flowers have that like trumpet shape. And that generally indicates that the flower is pretty specifically designed to having things like hummingbirds or butterflies, which have really long tongues to sip nectar at the very bottom of the flower. Versus for bumblebees, a lot of flowers tend to have really short stems or really short bases. And so the start of the flower is very close to the bottom of the flower that's going to hold the nectar. So in that sort of way, a lot of flowers are geared specifically towards certain types of pollinators.
I love that question, Miss Doll's class, so thank you so much for that. We've got time for about 2 more, so I'm going to go to Miss Russell and Miss C in the next minute or so. But I want to stress, even if you can't actually have a butterfly as a pet yourself, for any of our classes, wherever you are, there's probably a butterfly conservatory somewhere within driving distance. I know for me in Toronto, Niagara Falls has a just amazing one, and it's really quite a life-changing experience to see a whole bunch of chrysalis together, where butterflies are coming out of them, thousands of butterflies around you. So I really hope when the world opens up again, everyone in today's broadcast gets a chance to do that, because it's such a special experience. Miss Russell's class, come on in, guys, and then we'll wrap up with Miss C in a minute.
Okay, thank you. So we've been studying climate change a lot, and you mentioned that already in terms of an effect that it can have on pollinators, but we're wondering specifically about other specific reasons why you might find bees are dying. Whether it's, you mentioned invasive species, are there other things, whether it's not pollinating, what's causing them to not pollinate, and does that cause them to die?
Yeah, another great question. So yeah, there's a whole lot of things, and a lot of time we call it like a dangerous cocktail of different threats that's facing them, because it's like a mix of a lot of different things. Climate change is one of them. Habitat loss is one of them. Pesticides are a pretty big one in some places where, like I mentioned, when we spray pesticides all over a field, this is great because it kills the bad bugs. but pesticides don't discriminate. They can't tell between good bugs and bad bugs. And so if we use pesticides without thinking, in a not careful way, then we can kill a lot of the wild pollinators that end up, supporting these our very own agricultural crops. So pesticides are a big thing that often interacts with a lot of these other threats. Invasive species is another one. I mentioned honeybees as one invasive species that often has, or we think often has, a big impact on wild pollinators because they can remove some of the resources from wild ecosystems and communities around agricultural fields. Disease and parasites are other things that can impact bees. One parasite in particular is a varroa mite, this small little mite that lives inside of colonies, and they can wreak absolute havoc. Sometimes you can pick up a bee and you'll see it just covered in these little mites. And these also tend to be spread by invasive species. And so it's kind of a double whammy of invasive species can remove resources, and they can also be spreading a lot of these diseases and parasites as well to wild communities. And all of these things, again, kind of interact with destruction of habitat and with changing climates that make places more unsuitable. So yeah, unfortunately, a lot of things, but like I said, a lot of these things we know how to deal with. We know what to do about them. And by contributing to community science and by creating your own, good pollinator gardens, then you can help relieve the burden and help us discover a little more about these threats and how to stop them.
And I think that that's a really important thing. It does seem sort of overwhelming to think about climate and habitat and pesticides and invasive species, but there's so much that we can do as individuals, as a classroom, as a society to help combat this. Like, we know the solutions, which I think is a really important thing. And our classrooms today can really take positive action independently. So that's a really exciting message. And I'm glad we got that in. So thank you, Peter. Let's wrap up with Ms. Cottrell's class, and then I'll just share a few links where you guys can all learn more. I know we have more questions than we could possibly answer in one broadcast, but let's head to New York to wrap up.
Hi, our new student Carlene wants to know, why do bees make honey? I'm not sure if that was answered yet already, but.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, no, great question. And not one that I answered, yeah. So yeah, that's a really great question. And I'll start off by saying that not all bees make honey, actually. Only honeybees make honey, which sounds obvious when you say honeybees make honey, but bumblebees don't make honey. Bumblebees collect nectar from flowers and they bring it back to their colonies, but bumblebees have really small colonies. They generally have 20 to maybe 100 kind of individuals in a bumblebee colony, and the colonies at the end of every summer die out and the queens go into hibernation. So the whole colony is pretty small and it only lasts for one summer. So these bumblebees don't need to keep honey or keep food for long periods of time. It gets used pretty quickly. So when bumblebees bring back that nectar, they keep it in these little pots, which we sometimes call nectar pots, and then they store it for a couple of days later when other bees need it or whatever. Honey is a really, really cool thing that honeybees do. It's actually really awesome because basically they've kind of stored, they've kind of processed and shelf stored nectar. So honey is when honeybees bring back nectar into their colony or in their hive, honeybee hives are huge. A bumblebee colony can be maybe 100 individuals, maybe a couple of hundred. A honeybee hive can be thousands or tens of thousands of bees in a single hive. And so they're really like, a massive city. You're going from a classroom, which is like a bumblebee colony, to like a whole city, which is a honeybee colony. And so these honeybees need to store their food much better because also honeybee hives last multiple years. Every winter, the hive stays alive throughout the winter. And so they need to keep this honey, shelf stable. They need it to last throughout the winter when they won't have access to any resources at all for a very long period of time. So when honeybees bring back nectar into their hive, they feed it to their larvae, and the larvae actually secrete the honey from their own, or they chew the honey up, they chew up the nectar, they kind of process it in their mouths and they spit it out, and it kind of creates this new processed form of nectar, which is honey. And the honey lasts a lot longer. It's kind of like preserving it almost, and they can put that into their honeycomb and save a lot of that honey for later in the year and for throughout the winter. So really cool, really great question.
Great question, guys. I think you guys have been so awesome today, and the feedback on YouTube too of people that are, having their own honeybee hives or bumblebee groups in their classroom or working to plant pollinator gardens. Like, you guys are killing it. So way to go to a really fun and engaged audience today. Thank you so much, and worth going overtime for. Let's be rebels together. And this is a really important topic, and I'm so glad we got the chance to talk about it so enthusiastically today, Peter. This is great.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you everybody for asking questions, for engaging. I hope you're excited now to go out and do some things to help save the world.
On that note, I want to share a few quick links for everybody. Peter, if you want to learn more about Peter, he's got a website, Instagram, Twitter, the lot works. He highlighted all the cool stuff that he gets to do in his life generally, so do check that out when you're done. If you guys want to find out more about pollinator gardens and how to get involved with that, pollinator.org is an amazing resource. Peter also mentioned eButterfly, which is really, really cool, so I encourage you guys to check that out. And of course, at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, the thing we are most keen to get you in on is Backyard Bio. Get out, explore those pollinators, take pictures of all the bees, butterflies, and more that live near you, and everything else. Head to BackyardBio.net, share what you find with #BackyardBio, and we look so very forward to having so many groups involved. Peter, as you know, what we do to wrap up every broadcast, I'm going to bring in our teachers. So Miss Hamilton, Miss Dahl, Miss Russell, and Miss Cottrell, if you want to join me in saying a big thank you and farewell to Peter, you're all in. Thank you so much, guys.